I understand completely, and in some ways find it admirable for the baseball writers that voted no on Bonds and Clemens and A-Rod. A-Rod's first year on the ballot was this year. He garnered just 36% of the vote. I find that logic understandable, saying these guys cheated, knowingly cheated, not everybody cheated, and they shouldn't be rewarded. I understand that. And if that was a clean line of logic, I would abide by that. Hey, we know you cheated. We know they didn't cheat, so they get in and you don't. However, I found yesterday's vote to be broken. And here's why. And I've said this for the last couple of years. Bonds and Clemens deserve to be in Cooperstown because there's no way to know who did it and who didn't. And when you're using spotty evidence, incomplete evidence, making hard decisions, hard lines, drawing lines through some guys and circling others is incomplete in itself, and it's not efficient. For the guys that are in here, and let's not throw in the racists or the criminals because that's a whole different argument, okay? Bonds and Clemens weren't criminals because there are domestic abusers in the Hall of Fame. There are guys that clearly were open racists. Let's take that out of it. Let's just talk about cheating within the game. It's impossible to know, and most people agree, there are PED users already in, they just weren't caught. Now, Clemens and Bonds have a unique situation because they weren't caught either testing positive, but we know they did it. And anybody, let's just create this baseline here. I welcome your calls. I welcome your tweets. Don't come at me and say there's no evidence Bonds ever did it, because Bonds admitted he did do it. He said he didn't knowingly take PEDs, but he said the cream in the clear, which was documented that he took, he said he thought was flaxseed oil. It was not. So he is a known user of PEDs, not knowingly, and didn't test positive. You cannot say you know A-Rod and you know Clemens and you know Bonds, but because you don't know Jeff Bagwell and you don't know Mike Piazza and you don't know other guys, hey, what am I supposed to do? I don't know Pudge Rodriguez, so I got to vote him in, but I do know these other guys. That's a broken line of logic in my estimation because, as evidenced yesterday, you have David Ortiz. Now, David Ortiz actually failed a test when they were originally deciding whether to have mandatory PED testing at the outset of the 2000s. They had what was supposed to be anonymous testing to see whether or not X number of ball players tested positive, and thus it would enact mandatory testing. In this test, David Ortiz tested positive. The New York Times got a hold of this list and released his name. We don't know every name on that list. There was more than 100 players. The Times reported David Ortiz. So you might say, well, okay, there's the smoking gun on Ortiz. But they voted Ortiz in yesterday on the first ballot. On the first ballot. So Bonds and Clemens didn't get in for 10 years, even though they were superior players to David Ortiz. David Ortiz gets in on first ballot, even though he actually tested positive. Ortiz says, what did I test positive for? Baseball can't give you that information. Ortiz will say, well, I never tested positive again once we actually had testing. Baseball will say he never failed a drug test after that moment. And in that test, they didn't exactly know what they were testing for, whether it was illegal supplements, illegal, over-the-counter. So there's all this gray area. And this is the problem here. The problem is baseball writers have been entrusted with an impossible task to try to use incomplete evidence to find guilt. They're trying to make a decision on individual cases with incomplete evidence and information. It's broken. That's broken. So the only thing you can do, in my estimation, is you've got to vote on the very best of their generations. And when they're in Cooperstown, because clearly Bonds and A-Rod and Clemens were the best of the generation, you have to write on their plaques what's included in that legacy, which is messy, which is vague, which is gray area, which is confusing. The other part of this that's really uncomfortable for many is the players already in there that didn't take PEDs. Should they welcome in guys that knowingly did? And that's the other thing, is that there's a lot of people out there that just naturally hate the media. They hate the news media. They hate the political media. Thus, they start hating the sports media, etc. And it just kind of builds on itself. And so it's an easy target to just bash the media. However, if you ask any of these voters, they'll tell you, yeah, we were hard to get through, but former players are going to be even harder. That the Bonds and Clemens and A-Rod thing is going to be even harder for voters, the Veterans Committee, a bunch of former players that didn't take steroids. They're not going to look kindly on guys that did. So it's really not a media thing either. It's the entire landscape of baseball and how they view guys that cheated or got an unfair advantage in this game. I just think for everybody involved, you're asking them to do the impossible. You're asking them to judge every case using incomplete evidence and data and try to get it right. It's not going to be right. It's already not right. There are guys in there that definitely took PEDs. And so now it's just who was lucky enough to scoot by, who was lucky enough to play before testing was instituted, who was lucky enough to just be a nice enough guy. And that's the other part of this, which I find to be a really interesting dynamic. David Ortiz was a gregarious, easy to interview, lovable guy. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, salty, caustic, harsh. Nobody liked talking to Bonds. Bonds was a jerk. He was an open jerk to just about everybody, including teammates. So when these decisions are being made, does a guy who covered Big Papi want to look past the positive test and believe him because the guy was great to him, versus I don't want to look past the obvious with Barry Bonds because he was a complete jerk to me and everybody else. And we all hated covering that jackass. That's also clearly a part of this equation. How much of the equation, who knows? But I mean, David Ortiz is a first ballot guy and no questions about the positive test. The other guys are clearly superior players and never got in. So it's just really messy. It's all really messy, and there is no clean through line on this. There is no clean anything because, look, I love Cooperstown. I went there as a kid. I went there as an adult. I love it. Knowing I'm going to walk in and see my heroes like a Willie Mays, like a Jackie Robinson, like a Ted Williams. I'm going to go in there, and now I'm going to have to see Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens in there. Doesn't make me feel good, but I do think it's the fairest solution to a really complicated, messy question that really still didn't have much resolution because it's just now up to the Veterans Committee to do what the writers may or may not have done.